But it makes a difference in the bill, I'll guarantee you.
Butchie.
Well, what difference? Either your electric bill's high or
Call the
gas
director.
bill's high.
Well, no, electric heater doesn't use up that much juice, and I have my 68 for my
Thermostat, yeah.
thermostat.
Yeah, that's usually what I put mine on.
But I have to really cover up. I'm a cold-natured person. I really have to cover up.
Cover it. I do too, and then I got a little warm dog that sits on the lap.
Hey, Ed. I was gonna say there's your sister, but no.
No.
Looks like you
no,
might be
just
right.
Ed. Just Ed.
Good guy.
Yeah. Hello.
Glad to see ya.
Good. She up and around.
Yeah, I'm doing good. Doing good.
She was without like a cane or anything today.
Huh?
You were with-
Nope.
Mhm.
He told me his therapist said I didn't have to if I didn't think I needed it.
That's great.
And then your daughter's going, yes, you do need it. Go home. Go home.
You know, Joy, something tells me that your daughter is starting to drive you crazy a little
No,
bit.
she's not. I give her a bad time. I said, honey, you have to let me do what I can do. I'm not going to be an invalid.
I was talking to someone else just earlier this afternoon who was saying their kids were scolding them.
Yeah, it's a reversal of roles.
It's a bitter pill, it seems
Yeah,
like.
I kind of think I can remember doing my mother that way.
Yeah.
Probably so.
Sort of.
Comes back around. Well, how about let's begin? Would someone be willing to pray for us in our time together?
I will.
Thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to look into the Word.
Yeah.
And I pray that the Holy Spirit would anoint this room and open our minds into what is going to be said here today. And I thank you for this day and just being able to go to church and to be with other Christians. Well, we know throughout the world it's not like that. So we ask these things in your holy name.
Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Terry. Okay. Well, we are trying to cover. There she is.
Yeah, first time a half hour early and now
Watch out.
3 minutes late.
Your sister called it.
Yeah.
So we're covering chapters. We're starting in chapter 15, verse 22, because last time we went through chapter 15, verse 21, through the Song of Moses, and then Miriam's kind of song that she brings out of that. And then the hope is to see if we can't get through chapter 18 today. So did some of you get a chance to look over that section before now? I think most of you did. Okay. So if you're remembering the story thus far, so far they were in Egypt, and then God brought them through the Red Sea, right? And that's where we're picking up today. And then, do you know what happens in chapter 19? Did you get a chance to see what's happening there? Yeah, well, and that's fine. I didn't expect you to, but chapter 19 is when they arrive at Mount Sinai.
Oh, yeah, I did some of that.
So you kind of have, starting in Egypt, then the transition. They go through the wilderness, and then they arrive at Mount Sinai, and we're in that in-between place right now. So starting with where, 15 verse 22 and then through to 18, how would you kind of describe or summarize what happened?
Well, it did take them 3 days before they started complaining about something.
Yeah, it only took 3 days to complain.
Another 15 days, and they complained about something else. So,
Yeah.
and just he just parted the Red Sea, and they
Right.
went through dry ground, and they saw this.
Mhm.
And within 3 days, they're starting to question.
Yeah, God had just miraculously delivered them, and then immediately they were complaining. So in one way, part of what happens for those few chapters is multiple instances of the Israelites complaining, grumbling. That's one way you could characterize a part of it.
And then he tells them that if they, obey his commands, behave themselves, that he won't bring any of the diseases or any of the things on them that
Right. So this is when people study Exodus or think about Exodus, often they think about Mount Sinai as where God gives the law, because it is. It's where he begins the covenant. But he actually seems to start giving laws, statutes, ordinances before he begins the covenant ceremony at Mount Sinai. He's already teaching them and expecting obedience from them.
And also when he's also given the manna and the quail, and he's still trying to prove to them that he's God, even after he parted the Red Sea.
Right. So let's say more about that though. He's trying to, let's say he's trying to teach them, but he's not just trying to teach them that he's God. That's true. But what can we say more than that? Like, what is he specifically teaching them about himself? Because think about it. And maybe think about it in terms of contrasting it with what he did in Egypt. In Egypt, he did the signs and the wonders, the plagues and stuff. And then, he got him through the Red Sea. And in chapter 15, when Moses and the Israelites sing, what's the primary way that they characterize God, that they describe him?
As a warrior.
As a warrior. And remember how we talked about when he's doing those 10 plagues, it's battle. He's doing battle against Pharaoh and the gods, the Egyptian gods. In fact, when he does the killing of the firstborn, God says specifically that he's doing it in order to, I guess I should just quote him, in order to humble the gods of the Egyptians. I don't know if you guys remember that, and I'm not finding it right now. Aha, yes, that's in chapter 12, verse 12. He says, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night and will strike down all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. So one way of characterizing what God was revealing to Israel and Egypt in those first 15 chapters was that he's a mighty warrior. He can do battle against all of Egypt's gods, and he can defeat all of them. But in these next chapters, the end of chapter 15 through 18, what is he teaching them again? That he's the ultimate warrior God?
He's providing for them.
Yeah. He provides what? Food and water.
Water, yeah, but...
And of the food, specifically manna and quail.
And quail.
The
water was, Moses threw a stick in there.
Right. Well, and there's actually two instances with water. Right. In the first instance, the water is bitter, so he throws the wood in the water. And in the second instance, God tells him to strike a rock and water flows out. But in all of these ways, God is teaching that he is a God who's able to provide. And remember, I've kind of told you guys that in the ancient Near East, there was kind of this idea that gods had turf. They had dominion. They had areas that were under their control, literal like geographical areas. And so one other way of thinking about this is now that they're out of Egypt, maybe they might have been tempted to think, well, does God have authority here? Now we're outside of the land of Egypt. What can he do for us here? Because in our minds, we think like he just did all that, he just did all this. He brought us through the Red Sea. How could they doubt him? Well, it wasn't the concept of a God who had power in every sphere of life and was had ultimate power in every sphere of life. I mean, to my knowledge, that wasn't common. That wasn't something that religions believed in at the time. You might have some highest God who is more powerful than the others, but a God who was the ultimate warrior and who could provide all things and, do everything that he's showing them he can do. I think that would have been surprising to them. It wasn't something they were used to. Just because God is a warrior doesn't mean that he's a provider. See what I'm saying? Or in verse 26, at the end of it, he says, For I, Yahweh, am your healer. Just because he's a warrior doesn't mean he's a healer. In fact, don't the two kind of seem different? Killing people versus healing them? You know, and I think in ancient pantheons, you had often like a god who was in charge of war and violence and a god who was in charge of like medicine or healing or something like that. Okay, so yeah, in these chapters, one way of characterizing it is God is continuing to educate the people about what kind of God he is. And he's showing them that he's a healer, he's a provider. Is there anything else? He's a teacher. Remember, he's teaching them his statutes and ordinances, and he's a master because he expects them to obey. So, you know, I think I could be wrong, but I think that the end of chapter 15, that's the first time that we hear about, you know, he says, in verse 25, the second part of 25, it says, there he made for them a statute and a regulation, and there he tested them. Now, I could be wrong. I didn't scan the chapters before, but I think that might be the first time it refers to him giving a statute or a regulation or any kind of command. You know, I mean, up until now, he's told them to do things like cross the Red Sea. But this is, to my knowledge, the first time it uses that kind of language that we associate with the law. So maybe this is where they start to learn that he's a lawgiver.
Well, chapter 25 here, it says that, well, I mean,
Verse 25?
yeah. The Lord is issuing a ruling
Chapter 15.
ruling and instruction for them to put them to the test. So he's testing them.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's teaching them, and then he's testing them.
Right. So what do y'all think of when you think about God testing people?
Well, because they didn't believe that he was God, I guess, that overall, I mean, that's, he had to keep showing them that he could do things.
So testing them was a way of
Proving.
him testing them is a way of proving to them who he is. Because, well, I think what you're saying is true, Rita. But in my mind, if God is proving himself, that almost seems like he's testing himself. You know, like if I'm trying to think of a way of explaining this, like if a teacher gives a test to their students, a literal test, then it's the student who has to prove that they know the information on the test, right? So if I'm a teacher and I give you a test, I'm testing you. I'm not being tested. I'm not proving anything as the teacher. It's you that has to prove something. You prove that you know it. So when he's teaching them, I mean, I agree with you that he's teaching them who he is. But at the same time, they're supposed to be proving something. They're supposed to be showing what?
That they believe him.
That they know.
Okay, that they believe him or trust him,
And they have the
or
knowledge.
that they know and understand.
Yes.
But what, now this is one of the first questions I wanted to ask. In that first story, there at Mara, or at least that's what,
Where are you?
sorry, in chapter 15, verses 20 through 27, that's where you have the bitter waters, and so they come to call that place Mara because Mara means bitter, and they cry out to the Lord. The Lord shows Moses a tree. Did you notice there are no instructions that we have? We don't know if God gave Moses any instructions. It just says he showed Moses where the tree was, and then it doesn't even say that God told him to throw it in the water, right? Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right.
Showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. So, you know, it's possible that God gave him instructions and said, hey, you know, I just gave that tree special abilities. You know, if you throw it in the water, it'll make it sweet. Or it's possible that, you know, it was common in ancient times to know that certain plants had certain abilities and properties. And so maybe this tree was known to have kind of healing properties or the ability to do something to water. Who knows? But one way of looking at the story is Moses seemed to kind of just know what was going on. He just knew what to do with the tree or the wood. Do some of your translations say wood?
Mine said just a stick.
Just a stick?
Just a stick in there.
It says log.
Log?
Just as a tree.
That's funny, and some of ours just say tree. And it's really funny because if you imagine throwing a whole tree in the water, that's pretty different from just throwing a stick in there.
Well, it was a small tree, yeah.
Yeah.
It was like a stick.
Well, it comes from a Hebrew word that's just very flexible. It's a Hebrew word that's sometimes used for trees, sometimes used for sticks and logs.
Mine says a certain piece of wood.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I don't know. That's a fascinating translation. So he throws it in there. And then if the second part of verse 25, it says, there he made for them a statute and regulation, and there he tested them. And he said, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of Yahweh your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on which I have on you, which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, Yahweh, am your healer. Now that whole statement, what God says to him there, just perplexes me for a number of reasons. One, before that, it says, there he made for them a statute and a regulation. Where does he give a statute or a regulation in that story? What of anything that's happening in that story could be considered a statute or a regulation?
Thought the statute came afterwards. If you will diligently listen.
Mine doesn't say
Is that
statute.
not the
Well, that just
statute?
said-
So if you will, so the statute would be give earnest heed, because like, first of all, like a statute or a regulation normally is something like do not do this, like a prohibition, or do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is more like a promise. If, like he gives a condition, if you will give earnest heed or obey the voice of Yahweh your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, then, if this condition is fulfilled, then I will put none of the diseases on you which I put on the Egyptians. That's more of like a promise, a conditional promise, than it is like a statute or regulation. It implies obedience to other statutes and regulations. To me, it almost sounds like he's saying, it says, there he gave to them a statute and regulation. Then he says, if you obey my statutes and regulations, and it's like, well, which ones? Like, I thought we were going to learn what the statute or regulation was in this case.
Mine says, if you heed his commandments and keep all his precepts, I will not afflict you.
Right, and commandments, precepts, a lot of these words are related. The Hebrew language has lots of different words that are all kind of similar, like we do in English. We have these different words, commandments, statutes, ordinances. They're all different words, but they're all like kind of like rules, laws. So those are just different translations of the same words. But I'm just pointing out to me, it's not clear if there's some sort of specific statute and regulation that God gave in this situation. Or maybe it's saying like, this is maybe the first time that God kind of tells them, hey, following me being your God, that's going to mean you just have to obey me. I'm going to give you statutes and regulations. And maybe this is like one paraphrase of that paragraph would be to say, there at this time, God made it clear to his people that they were going to have to obey his statutes and regulations. And it's not really referring to a specific one. I don't know, that's one way. Or he gave them a statute and regulation and we don't know what it was. Or maybe it's Moses telling them to throw a tree in the water.
He's warning them he's gonna give them statutes and
Yep,
they
might be
better pay
that.
attention.
Some people read this passage as kind of telling you what's about to happen and that we don't really get it until chapter 16. So once we keep reading, maybe it'll make more sense. But some people read it as referring to what came before, that it's when God told them, I think I was trying to read that before here. It says, so here, this commentary says, I'll try and, what did I do? Here we are. I should make this bigger for you guys so that you can see. Let me see if I can do that. This is, oh, thanks. Put it over here.
There was a text size.
Yeah, here we go. Oh, and that, you're right. That would be better, Catherine. I'm sure this will be worth our time.
Mm-hmm.
I'll make it real big for fun. Okay. So let me just bring this over here and do this. Okay. It says verses 25b. When you see like a letter, like A or B or C, it's trying to tell you this is a longer verse. And so B here means the second half of the verse. 25b through 26 seem to be related to the events of verses 22 through 25. It's saying, so when it talks about statutes and regulation, this commentator thinks it's referring to what just came before in the story, though this is never made explicit. It is not even intimated that Israel's lament constituted a failure to give heed to God's commandments. But apparently, in view of this experience, it is anticipated that this could become a problem in the future. Thus, verse 26 is a preventative measure. It sets out guidelines for the shape of life beyond deliverance. Freedom from service to Pharaoh does not issue in anything goes world for Israel. Israel is freed from Pharaoh for service to God. At the beginning of this new journey with God, this is now made crystal clear. God's word to Israel is not casual advice concerning which a take it or leave it attitude may be adopted. The giving of any word by God is assumed to be in the people's best interests, indeed, those of the entire creation. That word will always be on behalf of life and well-being. So he's kind of saying that this statute and regulation is referring to what's just happened in the story, and saying that God is letting them know that everything he tells them is a command and something that they need to be obeying. But I think it's also possible to read it as kind of telling us what's about to happen in the story. So I just thought these are the kinds of details that if you're really paying attention will kind of confuse you. But if you stick with it and you spend a lot of time in the text, it'll slowly start to pay off and you might feel that you understand the text more. And notice, isn't it funny that they have this place and they're so thirsty and they're, they can't find any good water. And then God provides this solution of throwing the wood or the tree into the water. And then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. So they had an issue with water, and they complained. Well, did they complain in this one yet? They cried out to the Lord, which is good, but they said, "What shall we drink?" And then he solves that problem, and the next thing you know, they show up at like an oasis. It's got tons of springs and date palms. These are, I think, trees that I would assume have dates on them. I'm not sure.
Mine just says palm trees, not dates.
Oh, okay. I might have to look. But I think it's showing us like right after they have a crisis, they come to a place where like it's an abundant place where they have everything they need. It's just kind of ironic. Catherine's going to look it up for us. Also, think about it. It says in verse 26, he says, "I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, Yahweh, am your healer." Does all of your translations say, "I am your healer"?
Mine says, "Who heals you?"
Who heals you? Okay. Well, I don't know if the word originally means healer, but if you think about it, what God did in Egypt, they didn't have to, not all of what he did had to do with healing or sickness. Think about it, like they got boils on their skins. To our knowledge, there wasn't any kind of like illness from which they had to be healed from. There was hail, there were frogs, there were like flies or something. There was darkness, the Nile was turned to blood. What else? Yeah, so maybe the firstborn was some sort of illness, but we don't know. So I think here when he's talking about healing, we're not necessarily thinking of people who are physically sick. It's that God has this ability to either cause people harm or make them to damage them in some way, or to remove his protection so that they are harmed. But his promise here is he will. I don't know. It's kind of fascinating. I'm not sure I can explain it. On the one hand, he's saying, if you'll do these things, I'm not going to put any diseases on you, which is fascinating because he didn't really put any diseases on anybody. But also, he's promising on the one hand, I'm not going to put bad things on you, but he's also saying, I'm your healer. I'm the one who's going to do good things for you. I'm going to heal you if anything bad happens to you. So maybe this is kind of implying, look, I'm not going to put bad things on you. I'm not going to hurt you or make you sick. You might get sick, and I would rather be a God who heals you from the illnesses and the problems that happen in life than to have to cause you harm because you're being disobedient. Maybe that's one way to understand it. But do you see why? I'm being a little nitpicky, but I feel like this is when you get into these details and you say, like, wait, what disease did he put on people? And like, what does, it's one thing to refrain from hurting people, and it's another thing to say, I'm your healer. I'm the one that's going to, like, he's not saying, I'm going to hurt you, but then I'll heal you. Don't worry. I don't know. This isn't something worth me. I feel like the more I try and talk about it, the more it's sounding confusing. But, so then in the next story, when God provides the manna, if you look, someone read verses 4 and 5 for us.
Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily.
Okay. So notice again, he's testing the Israelites again, which
Some of them.
they fail. Some
Some of them gather too much.
right, exactly. Yeah.
Not all of them, but some.
Mm-hmm.
They did, he's teaching them about the Sabbath, really, what he's doing.
Right.
Teaching them.
Is it about the Sabbath?
That one day, he gave you a double portion.
Right, on the sixth day.
Yeah, and so the next day, he didn't even want them to come out of the house.
Right. And at this point in the story, he hasn't even told them about this thing called the Sabbath yet.
Yeah.
That word hasn't been used. He hasn't said, on this day you shall do no work. At this point, all he said is, on the sixth day, when they prepare what to bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So part of the question is, this is the second time it's referred to a test. And I forgot to kind of ask this question, but what is the test that they faced in the first instance? In chapter 15, verse 25, it says, there he made a statute and regulation, and there he tested them. What was the test there?
If they're going to pay attention to what he says.
Well, but that's the interesting thing. At this point in the story, when the waters are bitter, he hasn't, to our knowledge, told them anything. He hasn't given them any commandment that they're supposed to obey or not. He hasn't tried to teach them anything.
Well, probably be real patient because they're grumbling all the time about this and that.
Mm-hmm.
They're always thinking, well, it was better back in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps you could even look at it this way. One, let me give a couple options. One option is to say, the test is what they would do when they came to the bitter waters. And they passed the test because when they got there, they cried out to the Lord, and he immediately delivered them. And that was the right thing to do. When you come upon trouble, cry out to the Lord. That shows that they had faith that he could help them. Or you could say maybe that passage in verse 26 is getting us ready for this whole manna incident. That's more like a heading, and it's saying, there in the wilderness, God gave them statutes and regulations, and he tested them there in the wilderness. And then we get the first story in which he tests them, and it's with the manna. And we're being kind of warned or prepped for what's about to happen with the manna story. That's one other possible interpretation. And, then here with the manna, you kind of just answered it, but so one possible answer, if I say, what's the test in this manna story? You could say it's whether or not they will collect the manna as he instructs them, right? Whether they get just one day's worth, 5 days a week, and then 2 days worth on the 6th day. I wonder if it could also be considered part of the test that, I mean, they've already grumbled against him. In the first instance when they had a difficulty, they cried out to the Lord. And maybe that was good. Maybe that was passing the test. Here now with the manna, difficulty comes and they grumble against Moses. So maybe that could be considered a part of the test. What do they do when they come upon hardship? Do they reach out to the Lord or do they grumble? That's another possible interpretation.
They were used to abundant resources in Egypt.
Right.
Oh, I thought one of the reasons they came out of Egypt because they were slaves and they weren't getting food and water. They were getting bread, and every day they took something away from them, it seemed like.
Well, that's partially true. I think you're remembering that after Moses and Aaron go to them, Pharaoh gets angry and he says, now they have to go and collect all their own straw. And so they have to do twice as much work.
Yeah,
But it seems like in Egypt,
they had plenty of food.
they had plenty of food. There's another story almost just like this in Numbers,
Okay.
where they complain in a very similar way and they say, oh, that we were back in Egypt where we had onions and cucumbers and blah. And it's a list, like a grocery list of all the things they had.
Lots of meat.
And it sat next to our pots of meat.
I think you said in here that they had to eat that manna for 40 years.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Uh-huh.
Oh boy.
Yeah, right. So, in a sense, in Egypt, we get the impression they had lots of food and a variety of food. And we had that whole story where at the end, as they're leaving, they're able to ask their neighbors for their jewelry and they give it to them, which tells us they lived like in neighborhoods with Egyptians. They didn't, we think of slavery and we think of like slaves on plantations being treated absolutely terribly, and they didn't have like white neighbors next to them that they could go and ask for their jewelry. That would have resulted in terrible things. No, it seems like here in Egypt, they were slaves, but not like we think of them. Like they were neighbors. They could go and knock on their neighbor's door, and they had decent food. And then they come out into the wilderness, and they can barely find water, and they can't find food at this point. But so the basic point here is they grumble, and then God not only provides them with the manna, but he gives them the quail, right? Because they specifically complained about not having meat.
Oh yeah, the story is in here.
Well, but that's what's fascinating. An exact same story happens in Numbers chapter 11, where they complain and God rains down quail on them. So part of what I'm trying to show you, or we can't see now, is that many of the stories in Exodus are mirrored in Numbers. You have like almost the exact same story happen. And they're in different locations, but it's basically the same test, the same situation. They grumble. God answers with the same solutions. But there are differences in the stories too. But many have claimed that this is not only like what we believe happened, but the authors of the story are authors, Moses, or scribes that might have helped collect all of Moses' writings or whatever, that they are organizing these stories in order to show you on both sides of Sinai that you had kind of like similar situations happen. And there's a number of reasons for that. But you will find similar stories on the other side of Mount Sinai when they wander further in the wilderness. I have other nitpicky questions, but maybe I'll come back to them. But you notice the theme of grumbling and complaining. And, I mean, Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 makes really clear that this was a bad thing, that they grumbled against God and against his servant Moses. And I think it's always worth being reminded that, how we complain and grumble. And how we complain and grumble. And there are times, there's a time where he says, okay, yeah, verse 8 of chapter 16. Moses said, "This will happen when Yahweh gives you meat to eat in the evening and bread to the full in the morning. For Yahweh hears your grumblings, which you grumble against him. And what are we? Your grumblings are not against us, but against Yahweh. So they think they're grumbling against Moses.
Yeah.
But in reality, they're grumbling against God. And I think that kind of does in a different, it's not the exact same, but begs the question in our life when we're grumbling. We might think we're just complaining, we're not thinking we're complaining against God, but in the end, we are.
Sometimes you complain against something you could see, but
Uh-huh.
you don't see.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, good point. So I talked about this how the Sabbath observance worked back when I preached on this earlier in the year, but I don't expect you to remember. What do you think the purpose of the Sabbath test was? What was God trying to do?
Did it have to do with worship? To think he was, all he did for you? I don't know.
I think you're going in the right direction.
I'm confused how to come about with it.
Well, in some ways, I'm asking you a question, and it might be confusing you because you might be thinking of really simple, correct answers, and you're trying to come up with something more complicated.
They needed a day of rest, really.
Okay, well, he's trying to give them a day of rest. That's true.
That he's going to provide for them? No
Well,
matter
he's
what?
teaching them that he'll provide,
Yeah.
but also remember,
That day they're going to have enough to take care of them.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know.
But think about it. Okay, so remember, 5 days they were only allowed to gather just as much as they needed for that day. And on the 6th day, they had to gather twice as much. And remember, on the first 5 days, if they did get more than they needed for the next day, on that next day, that food would rot or melt. On the 6th day, though, the rules changed. How things worked changed. So it's on like a basic level, it would be kind of confusing. The thing that's true for most of the week, all of a sudden, it's the opposite. Most of the time, don't gather too much. On this one day, gather too much. So that tells you it's not about like figuring out what the principle is in the first 5 days and making sure you keep it. There's a deeper principle, a deeper thing that God is trying to teach his people, right?
Is it greed? Something to do with being greedy?
Well, you
Or
could say
wanting
maybe
more than you.
Yeah, on the first 5 days, you could say that it's also about greed. Like potentially there's a concern for taking food that is intended for other people or not trusting God. I heard a desert father saying that Catherine shared with me that greed or avarice is to not trust God. It's to believe that he won't provide or give you enough. And so you gather too much to yourself. But just one simple way of saying what God is doing is he's testing his people. This Sabbath teaching is a test. It's a test to see whether or not they will obey his instructions and understand them. Will they do what he says on those first 5 days and then do what he says on the 6th day? Even though the rules change, will they pay attention and obey him? So he's testing them, and through the test, he's teaching them, right? He's teaching them to depend on him and to have faith, to believe him, to trust him, to be good students and learn, like pay attention to his directions. Let's see. It's funny. Moses gets angry with them when they're not getting it. Terry asked a good question. It says they would gather an omer, and an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. An ephah is 22 liters, which would be a lot, right? So 1/10 of that would be a little over 2 liters. So
Mine said somewhere it was a quart or two quarts.
I might.
Yeah, mine says an omer was about 2 quarts, which
Yeah.
is, or 2 liters, which is what you just said.
Okay, yeah. So, but you can imagine for a day that would make a decent amount of bread. Or I guess I don't know if you had to make bread with it. I guess you could just eat it as it
somewhere
was.
I thought I read in that he said something about making something. Boiling, something about boiling it.
Hmm.
Um,
Maybe.
I never know where I find it, but.
Maybe he did.
So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe
Say
you could,
whatever's
Where,
left to keep
what
it in
verse do you
until
find
morning.
it, what verse?
That was that,
Oh,
3.
23?
yeah. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil. So yeah, it seems like they did cook it some way. Because maybe that was one way to stay sane 40 years in the wilderness with the same stuff.
Mhm.
Cook it in different ways, you know? But also, it is fascinating. You know, when people think about the Sabbath in the Old Testament, where do you think, where do you think they would go to learn about the Sabbath in the Old Testament?
I would say in the tabernacle, that just seems the logical place.
Okay, like location, but I'm thinking like,
And they followed Jesus up on the hill.
no, well, what I'm saying is, where in the Old Testament do you expect to learn
Well,
about
that
the...
Jesus is the New Testament.
Yeah. But where in the Old Testament do you expect to learn about the Sabbath? Like, if someone were to say,
Genesis
The
off
Ten
bat tells you
Commandments?
about the Sabbath.
okay, yeah, you could talk about Genesis 1, but there, even though it talks about rest, it doesn't use the word Sabbath. So if someone were saying, hey, Terry, if I were going to go read in the Bible, like, the text about the Sabbath, to learn about the Sabbath, where would you point them to? I would probably think to point them to the Ten Commandments.
That's what I was gonna say, the
Okay.
Ten Commandments, first time.
I think when most
heard
people think of,
Sabbath.
you're right. I think when most people think about the Sabbath, they think about the fourth commandment or one of the 10 commandments.
Does Sabbath mean Saturday?
No, it was on Saturday. Sabbath means stop. Means stop it.
Oh, stop it.
Yeah, it's the day when you stop it. Quit working. Quit doing things. It's a time for gathering, treating the day as holy, and resting. So, but part of what I'm trying to say is, for a long time, I just thought about the Sabbath in terms of that commandment. But if you only knew what that commandment tells you in Exodus chapter 20, you wouldn't know everything God taught about the Sabbath. He started teaching about the Sabbath back here in chapter 16. And so if you want to know everything that you're supposed to know about the Sabbath, you have to read chapter 16, you have to read chapter 20, and guess what? You have to read other things, because later on he tells you more about what it means to keep the Sabbath. And it's just, you know, there are some Christians today who still say you have to keep the Sabbath, and that means on Saturday. You need to keep it on the 7th day of the week, because that was a law that he gave in the 10 Commandments. You obey all the other 10 Commandments. But then if you say you need to keep the Sabbath, then, well, should I pay attention to all the other scriptures that teach me about the Sabbath? Because, you know, here, Sabbath keeping is connected to manna. You know, does that mean anything for me? Or later on, it tells us that the Sabbath, and it's like later on in Exodus, I think chapter 31, it says that the Sabbath was a sign of the Israelites' covenant with God. Well, do we have that same covenant as Israel had with God? Is it a sign of our covenant with God? Many Christians would say, no, we have a different covenant through Jesus. And so we don't have to keep that. So it's just kind of complicated. The Sabbath is this really big concept. Today we read that Leviticus passage, and the Sabbath was like this basic idea that shaped their whole calendar. Not just once every 7 days, but once every 7 years, and then once every 7 times 7 years. Yeah. So the Sabbath was this huge idea and concept that required a lot of understanding God's word and obedience. It really affected their whole life. Chapter 17, we have another problem. One thing that's interesting, would someone read verse 2 of chapter 17?
So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?
Okay. Isn't that interesting? It's not God testing them. They're now testing God. And that's a problem, isn't it?
Oh boy.
They shouldn't be testing God. Now, it's kind of interesting. It's a similar idea. Remember earlier he said, it's not me you're grumbling against. It's God you're grumbling against. And so here he's saying, why are you quarreling with me? You're testing the Lord in doing this. Picking a fight with Moses. So Moses cries out to the Lord, and notice that this is a theme throughout the Bible. Someone comes into a difficult situation, they cry out to the Lord, and he hears them in their distress. That's a line in the Psalm. Psalm 107, says, gives all these different situations, like we were like, what is it? It's like the people were out in the wilderness, and they cried out to the Lord in their distress, and he heard their cry, and he delivered them from their distress. Or there were sailors who were on a ship, and the waves were crashing against them, and then they cried out to the Lord in their distress, and he delivered them from their distress. This is a huge theme. We had it in Genesis, when Hagar, the Egyptian slave, when Abraham and Sarah cast her out, and she went out into the wilderness, he heard the cries of her boy, Ishmael, and he saved them. And remember at the beginning of the Exodus story, God hears the cries of the Israelites in their distress. So this is kind of a theme throughout Scripture, that when people cry out in distress, God hears them, and it points to who he is. Let's see. And the water and the rock, it happens at a place called Massa and Meribah. And that becomes kind of an important place. There's, throughout Scripture, this gets mentioned, like Psalm 95 mentions this story. Many of the Psalms mention the story of them going through the wilderness. But Psalm 95, let me just show you real quick. You don't have to turn there with me. Psalm 95. It's like verse 8 of Psalm 95. Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as in the day of Massa in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me. They tried me, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation, and said, they are a people who err in their heart, and they do not know my ways. Therefore I swore in my anger, truly they shall not enter into my rest. So many of these stories become the kind of the backbone of the Israelite theology of understanding what's the problem with humans. We tend to, though we have just seen what God has done, we put God to the test. The story of fighting Amalek, where Moses has to keep his hand up in the air with the staff.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or questions about that?
Only that whatever happened to his staff? Was it put into the
To the ark?
yeah.
I don't think so. I think that was Aaron's staff. And I think that was a different one. But I could be wrong. That's a good question. I don't know.
Because that staff seemed like it was there all the way through all that stuff in Egypt and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and then he parted the waters with it, and now he's controlling an army battle out there with
Yeah.
it. So
It seems like a big deal.
yeah, that staff should be something that they could even when they went into the promised land, they should be led by that staff.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering.
Yeah. I don't think it gets kept. I think it's Aaron's rod that, when there's another rebellion, all the different tribes come up and they all have to submit their rod or their staff, and he submits his, and it's the only one that blossoms or blooms, and so they place it in the ark as a reminder that it is his tribe that has the priesthood. But yeah, I don't know. It's really clear in the story. Well, and it's kind of the question, is it the staff or is it the arm of Moses?
Yeah, his arm.
Or is it Moses? I mean, it's kind of all different ways of saying the same thing. The point is not the staff, it's Moses' arm. And it's not really his arm, it's who Moses is. And it's not really who Moses is, it's God whom he represents. He's this really important mediator. He's a mediator between God and Israel. And he has authority both. He's instrumental in getting the provision they need, like the food and the water. It's through Moses and striking the rock and his crying out to the Lord that he provides for Israel. And it's also through him that they win their battle. And so I think this is trying to kind of pave, or for us Christians, this is beginning an idea or an image for us. It's starting to create the idea for us of what it looks like when a human is a mediator between us and God. And our need for someone. We need someone to stand in the gap for us who can cry out to God on our behalf and who can also get for us the things that we need because of his favored status with God. It's because Moses is favored by God that he's able to do all these things. You know? So when we reach Jesus and we learn that he's our mediator, we can say, yeah, I've been expecting this. We've been needing this. Someone who could be perfect and favored by God and get us everything we need. Let me see. Was there anything else in that story that y'all wanted to talk about? It's fascinating. Aaron and Hur support his hands. Hur is from the tribe of Judah. And so some have thought that what this is showing is the importance of, on the one hand, the priesthood, because Aaron symbolizes the priesthood, and Hur is the head of the tribe of Judah, and Judah becomes kind of the head tribe. And that's the tribe out of which the Messiah comes. So it's kind of like priest, king, and prophet, the three offices of the Old Testament. Also, think about it. When they were fleeing from the Egyptians, did they fight the Egyptians at all? No. But here, they fight, right? Joshua leads them in battle.
They must be really strong towards Moses, because if they're fighting and they're seeing Moses up on a hill, and he raises his hands, they fight harder. When he loses it, they start losing.
Right.
So they must have been very strong, towards Moses.
Well, and that points to two kind of possible interpretations. One is, like, he's their captain, and they feel courage because of him. It's kind of like this group identity thing. Or another interpretation is to say that staff is what's caused miracles to happen. And so it's not because of team spirit, it's because God is miraculously working through him raising his arm to give them the victory. Or it could be both.
Yeah. That staff has done a lot of things,
Yeah.
As long as you got that staff up, you ain't gonna worry about it.
Right, but and again, the point is not that the staff is special. It's that God has blessed the staff.
Because Aaron and them couldn't hold the staff for Moses.
Right. Great point. Yeah.
That's what I got out. I mean, they couldn't do it.
Right, he didn't just hand it off.
That might be important, but without Moses, it wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even think of it that way. That's great. But also think about this. In their first battle with Pharaoh, God just delivered him. He said, stand by and watch as I give you salvation. Here, they have to fight for it. And so some have pointed out, and I think it makes sense to me, that God is kind of graduating them to like more mature levels of faith. Originally, God just kind of did it, and it was pretty passive for them.
Yeah, they cooked it.
But now they have graduated to a new level. God is trying to teach them, okay, I've delivered you, but you also need to now fight to keep what I've given you. And that might be a kind of instructive for us as Christians, that yes, when God saved us, it was all in his power. We could do nothing for it. But once we are saved, we have to continually keep obeying God in order to keep our salvation, in order to stay in good relationship with him, in order to, or maybe one thought is saying like keeping salvation, but it's also to go from one salvation to the next, to go to greater salvation, deeper salvation. We need to be saved deeper and deeper, further and further, and we will experience greater and greater trials throughout life. And so we need God to keep delivering us, but he's going to expect us to participate in that salvation. He's not just going to always do all the work for us. And then you have to be reminded, but in this battle, they could not have won it just by trying hard. It was because of Moses' uplifted hand and staff, which tells us they needed to participate, but they wouldn't have been able to do it if God had not made it possible. And so always at the end of the day, we remember every salvation and every degree of salvation is only possible by God's grace. But the further we walk with him, the more he expects us to participate in what he's making possible. Last things in the last 5 minutes, chapter 18, with Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. Do y'all remember what was kind of weird about him when we were introduced to him?
I don't remember when we were introduced to him.
You might not have been there that day. We read about him. We were first introduced to him in chapter 2 of Exodus because Moses kills someone. Pharaoh gets mad, so Moses flees Egypt, and he goes to Midian, and that's where he meets
Yes.
Jethro and his daughters and gets married.
Yes.
And he works as a shepherd for Jethro. But do you remember what was weird when we encountered him the first time?
So that he was a priest?
Well, he was a priest of Midian. That's true. So he would have likely worshipped other gods. Some people think that the Midianites might have been, you can look at some of the genealogies, and the Midianites were descendants of, like, Noah. So they're like long-lost relatives, like most people in the Bible. The Egyptians are distant familial relatives. But some people think that the Midianites might have still known about Yahweh as descendants of Noah. I don't know enough to talk about that, but I'm just letting you know. So some have thought that maybe Jethro was so open to the God of Moses and the Israelites because he already knew about him, in part. But I was also pointing out, when we were first introduced to him, he was given 2 names, Jethro and Royal. And I think he's given maybe one more. I'm trying to remember if Hobab is his name or if that's his nephews. But he has a couple of different names, but Jethro is the main one we know him by. And did anything strike you about that story? Jethro and Moses meeting back up and their conversation?
Yeah, then Moses gave his daughter back to him for a while there.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I was going, whoa.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could do that for her, get her to like that.
Well, I do think in the ancient world, before a woman was married, she was under the protection and the household of her father. And so if she got married and then her husband died or divorced her, she would go back into the protection of her dad's house. And so I do think it might have been more normal in those days if a man went on a journey for a long time or something, that he would said, hey, why don't you go stay with your dad for a while and be under his protection.
Yeah, that's what it seemed like to me, that he was busy for a while.
Well, and it was a pretty dangerous situation. He was marching into Pharaoh's courts and making him mad and risking his life all the time, and it was making life harder for the Israelites, so maybe he was trying to spare his wife from difficulty.
Then he became kind of like a priest, and everybody with all the problems came to him. And he ain't had time for his wife if he's sitting here listening to problems and trying to solve them.
It's really fascinating that you say he became like a priest. What makes you think he was like a priest?
Well, they have to go to someone,
Uh-huh.
and they look at Moses as a very wise man, a man of God.
Uh-huh.
So I would say that they would look at him as a priest where you might go consult him
Mm-hmm.
and find out what God might want them to do.
Right. Well, it's fascinating. This whole time, I think that it's dead on. One, within the narrative, you notice Aaron is like the head priest. He's the high priest. He's the one who does the Day of Atonement. But Moses is the one who tells him how to do it all. He gives him all the instructions. He's the one that, like, Moses and Aaron can't even go into the tabernacle until Moses comes to Aaron and consecrates him first. He has to, like, put blood on his earlobe and his thumb and on his big toe, and he has to do all the rituals. So Moses is kind of being a priest to Aaron the high priest, and he's doing priestly duties. He's the mediator between God and the mediator. So there's kind of degrees. Also, Hebrews depicts Moses as a priest because he talks about Moses being faithful over all God's house. Moses is depicted as like having authority and the ability to go into God's house, and it was really only the priests who could do that. So he is being depicted as a priest, but also as a prophet, and here as a judge, because he judges different matters, which is ironic because when Moses fled from Egypt, it was because it was right after two Israelites got in a fight, and he said, "Hey, why are you striking one another?" And they said, "Who are you? Are you a judge between us?" And it's kind of foreshadowing that they're saying, you're not our judge, but what do you know? He becomes all of Israel's judge. And also, it's really cool. Moses sits down with Jethro, and starting in verse 8 says, Moses told his father-in-law all that Yahweh had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had befallen them on the journey, and how Yahweh had delivered them. Jethro rejoiced over all the goodness which Yahweh had done to Israel in delivering them from the hand of the Egyptians. So Jethro said, Blessed be Yahweh who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods. Indeed, it was proven when they dealt proudly against the people. So this is, remember, we've been talking about this. Egypt has been trying to, Exodus, the book of Exodus, has been teaching us that God's mission and purpose, the reason why he took them out of Egypt and the reason he did it in the way he did, like hardening Pharaoh's heart over and over, was so that he could prove to all of Egypt and all the nations that he was the most high God, the most powerful, true God. And we see that, like, at the end of the Song of Moses, he, like, sings about how the other nations are now fearing Yahweh because of what he's done in defeating Egypt. But now, it's not just that God has struck fear into other nations. Now we have a new believer. We have someone who is confessing that Yahweh is the one true God. So God is accomplishing his mission of making his name known throughout all the nations. This is someone from another nation. And also notice that he's from another nation. This is already showing that God's will is not just to save the Israelites, but to save people outside of Israel too. And the next thing we know, a priest of Midian is teaching Moses, the priest of Israel and the prophet of Israel, how to do his job well. Giving him good advice.
Yep.
And it's funny, throughout the story, Moses, he says, you're not going to be able to do this. You're going to be burdened. This is going to be too great a burden for you. And sure enough, later on in the story, Moses starts complaining to God and saying, I can't carry this people. They're too much of a burden for me. If you're going to make me do this, just kill me now. That's what he says on Mount Sinai. And notice Moses' father-in-law tells him what to do. And then in verse 19 he says, Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God. Then teach them the statutes and the laws, and make known to them the way in which they are to walk and the work they are to do. That's exactly the job of the priest. Later on, when God tells the priest what they're supposed to do, is that they're supposed to represent God to the people and people to God, and they're supposed to teach the people God's statutes and his instructions. And then look at verse 23. He gives them all the advice about how to appoint other judges, and he says, If you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people also will go to their place in peace. So Jethro gives Moses this advice because he wants Moses to endure. He doesn't want him to burn out, get overwhelmed. And I think that that's a good reminder to us that we need wisdom in order to endure as believers, as followers of Christ, that you and I need to be discerning. We need to have understanding from God's word, and we need community. We need other believers, people who are wise, to help us, give us good advice, to tell us when we're wrong, so that we can have the endurance we need to finish our race. Any other thoughts or questions? Oh, we're 5 minutes over. I'm sorry. I thought we were.
Strange that they take advice from a Midianite priest.
Yep.
I mean, it doesn't seem like God would have instructed Moses
Mm-hmm.
in that some of these matters.
Yeah, it seems kind of scandalous. You would almost expect God to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm your teacher. What are you doing listening to that guy?
Yeah.
Well, God's already turned him around.
Mhm.
He already believed that he was the the only God.
Right.
So I'm sure Moses listened to him.
But it points to kind of the scandal of that Scripture's trying to teach us. God works through humans. That's just unbelievable. And sometimes he works through new believers who just barely came to the faith. And he speaks through people. So I think, sometimes you find out that something that happened in the story was bad because later on in the story, it turns out to be bad. Like bad things happen. But as far as I know, this all works out well. It's a good thing that people were appointed as elders to help Moses with judging disputes. And so it seems like it was a good word from Jethro.
And it probably helped his married life too.
Yeah, right. Yeah. All right, well, let me say a prayer for us and we'll go. God, thank you for your word. And we do ask for wisdom. We want to endure to the end. We want to finish our race well. We thank you for Moses. We thank you for Jesus, our great high priest, who has gone before us and who is our perfect mediator with you, Father. And help us to notice the people in our lives who have said holy words from you that we need to listen to. And please give us people to speak those words and give us ears to hear. And help us to be your mediators to the world out there, to be priests in the line of Jesus who go out into the world to help other people know what you have taught and commanded. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well,